Who could avoid the statement by President Trump this week declaring that Jerusalem is Israel's capital, as Mark mentioned, and his intentions to eventually move the embassy from Tel Aviv to Jerusalem. And as expected, now you all weren't surprised, the world is outraged. Criticism began pouring in as the world leaders commented on this statement. I'd like to read some of these to you. Abbas, the Palestinian Authority, rejected the statement and immediately called Russia, France, the Pope, and King Abdullah of Jordan. Ismail Haniyeh, the Hamas chief, stated that he had crossed every red line. Erdogan of Turkey said that Jerusalem is the red line of the Muslims. And of course, the Ayatollah Khomeini said they claim they want to announce Quds as the capital of the occupied Palestine. And of course, they're referring to Israel being the occupiers, and the term Al-Quds is actually the Arabic name for the city of Jerusalem. They won't even use the name Jerusalem. Pope, chimed in and said that we should recognize the rights of all people. King Abdullah warned of the dangers of the repercussions that would take place, and King Salman, the Saudi king, said that it would inflame feelings of Muslims all over the world. And King Mohammed VI of Morocco said that he had deep concerns. And of course, this was a letter that he had written to the 57 members of the Organization of the Islamic Cooperation of Al-Quds, the committee. So, and of course, they're trying to preserve that city as Al-Quds, as they call it. One can only wonder what will befall Jerusalem as a result of this statement. For those who have watched Jerusalem in the news over the many decades, certainly are taking note as to what will be the outcome. Will Israel take hold of this newfound enthusiasm? And you could hear some of those reports of the people there on the streets that were very enthusiastic about what the president said. And will they support and begin to restore their religious heritage? Will world leaders in Muslim countries stand by as major changes take place in Jerusalem? What will be the response from countries that don't even recognize Jerusalem as the capital of Israel, who hate Israel, who want to see Israel vanquished, driven into the sea, and annihilated as a people? And what role will the United States and Britain play in the responsibility and the security of the region? Will the Pope be involved? And will he put forward a solution for the crisis that is sure to arise? That's my comments on that statement and the questions that you might be asking. What shall befall Jerusalem? Jerusalem is a city that is mentioned 809 times in the Bible. And there are page after reference. When you go back and look at the exhaustive concordance, I didn't have time to go through all of them and look at them, but you could do that in a private Bible study. The very first mention is in Genesis, the 14th chapter. I'd like to go back there, which the name of the city actually was called Salem. Look at Genesis, the 14th chapter, and verse 18, I should say. Picking it up in verse 17, and the king of Sodom went out to meet him. Of course, this is talking about Abraham or Abram after his return from the slaughter of Kedorlaomer, and the kings that were with him in the valleys of Sheva, and which is the king's dale. And Melchizedek, king of Salem, brought forth bread and wine, and he was the priest of the Most High God. Commentators will say that Salem is modern-day Jerusalem. Even my commentary here says in the bottom here that it is the ancient Canaanite city of Jerusalem. It is mentioned in the Ebla tablets that are where it is called Jerusalema. They're mentioned in the Egyptian execration text where it's called Yerushalima, and in the Amarna letters where it states or it uses a term Jerusalem or Beth Shalem, the city of Salem or the hill of Salem. But this is a good place here where the Bible can interpret the Bible. When we go over and look at, just hold your place there and flip over to Psalms, the 76th chapter. This here is a perfect reference here, explanation, or a place where the Bible actually interprets the Bible. Look at Psalm 76 down in verse 2, where David says in verse 1, "In Judah is God known, his name is great in Israel. In Salem also is his tabernacle and his dwelling place in Zion." So David here tells us what Salem is, that it is the place where his tabernacle dwelt, and his dwelling place is in Zion. Of course, all the scholars know that he's referring there to Jerusalem. It is an ancient city as I said, during the days of Melchizedek. It is also the city where Abraham would offer Isaac eventually. And you know the story, how he carried him up into the land of Moriah and was about to sacrifice his own son. And this is also the mountains range here that is situated between the Jordan Valley and the Mediterranean Sea, where 1,000 years later Solomon would actually build the temple of God there, and yet another 1,000 years beyond that, further into history, modern history, when Jesus would be crucified on its hills. It was a unique mountain range there and a place for this city to be built. In Joshua, the 15th chapter, it had become known as Jebus, Jebus. I'd like to go over there and look at that reference. Joshua, the 15th chapter, down in verse 8. And this is when the nation of Israel moved into the land of Palestine, and they broke up, or they divided the territory among the 12 tribes of Judah. Of course, we know that Levi didn't get an inheritance. But look down in verse 8. I'll just read this one. This is the territory of Judah, and it gave the borders. And the borders went up by the valley of the sons of Hinnom, under the south side of the Jebusite. The same is Jerusalem. So there was a place where the Jebusites were inhabited, and it was called Jebus. And look at another one there. It's over just a few pages in Joshua, the 18th chapter, down in verse 28. And this is the territory of Benjamin. Benjamin and Judah shared the border of their territories, and it gives the borders of Benjamin here down in verse 28, and Zelah and Eleph and Jebusi, and that again there is the reference there about Jebus. That's Joshua the 18th chapter down in verse 28, which is Jerusalem. And of course he goes on to talk about that being the inheritance of the family of Benjamin. And this was the border that they shared. David took this city, and I'd like to go over to 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter. And these are all stories that are so familiar to you, so I'm just going to read quickly the references here. In 2 Samuel, the 5th chapter, this is when this is kind of an overview here of David being anointed king over all of Israel down in verse 3. And David was 30 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned 40 years. In Hebron, he reigned over Judah 7 years and 6 months. And in Jerusalem, he reigned 33 years over Israel and Judah. All of the 12 tribes of Israel, of course, David was king over them when it was a united kingdom. And the king and his men went to Jerusalem into the Jebusites, the inhabitants of the land, which spake unto David, saying, Except you take away the blind and the lame, thou shalt not come in hither. Thinking David cannot come in hither. They were trying to keep David out of this city. Nevertheless, David took the stronghold of Zion, and there is another reference there. We'll see it later, another name that was used for the city of Jerusalem. The same is the city of David. And of course, you recognize that name. David said on that day, whosoever gets up to the gutter and smites the Jebusites, evidently there was a drainage ditch or something that they were able to crawl up. Because, this city was set up on a hill. It was said that at one point, this city was practically impregnable because it had valleys on 3 sides except for the north side that was guarded by, that was their only entrance into the city. Later on, in some of the people that besieged Jerusalem found that out, that it was very difficult to try to take the city. He says down here, David dwelt in the fort and called it the city of David down in verse 9. And David built round about from Milo and inward, and David went in and grew great, and the Lord God of hosts was with him. So we see here in verse 8 that he smite the Jebusites and the lame and the blind that are hated of David's soul, and he shall be chief and captain. Wherefore they said, the blind and lame shall not come into the house. And of course David took the city there. It was a fascinating story how they took the city. David eventually erected a temple there. And of course, this wasn't the stone temple, but it was actually something similar to what they carried around in the wilderness, where he would also bring the Ark of God into Jerusalem. If you remember that story, and how, Uzzah tried to stay the Ark, and he was killed, and they waited some bit of time before they actually brought the Ark into Jerusalem. He built his own house there, and that's, I believe, why they called it the city of David, because he dwelt there. And you remember, he had a great desire to build the temple of God. He said, I live in this fabulous house. God had allowed him to build a fabulous quarters there, and he was living in this nice stone house with probably marble and woodwork and all of that. And here the Ark of God was in a tent over here, and he felt terrible about that, and he wanted to build the temple, but of course God said, because of your bloody hands, you're not to build the temple, but I'll let your son. So David went about collecting all of the resources and the materials that they would eventually later be used in building the temple there in Jerusalem. In 1 Kings 15th chapter, we see that this city was established not just by David, but by God. 1 Kings, the 15th chapter, and verse 4. It says, this was a wicked king was reigning in Judah. And at verse 3 it says, and he walked in all the sins of his fathers, which he had done before him, and his heart was not perfect with the Lord his God, as the heart of David his father. Nevertheless, for David's sake, did the Lord his God give him a lamp in Jerusalem, to set up his son after him, and to establish Jerusalem. God had selected that city, and he had meant for it to be established for a great purpose. So these kings reigned one right after the other in Jerusalem. In 2 Kings, the 20th chapter, we find the story of Hezekiah here, where he actually brought water into the city. It was as I said, a very stronghold up there on the top of the hill. It's 2 Kings, the 20th chapter. I know I'm kind of skipping along here real quickly, but wanted to get some of these interesting points. And this is at the very end of Hezekiah's life. 2 Kings, the 20th chapter, down in verse 20. It said, the rest of the acts of Hezekiah and all his might, and how he made a pool and a conduit and brought water into the city, are they not written in the book of the Chronicles of Kings of Judah? And Hezekiah slept with his father. Historians know, and there is actually a reference about the tunnel that Hezekiah built. It was actually a tunnel that went from the spring of Gihon into the pool of Siloam within the city gates, city walls. They actually hewed out of rock, through the base of this mountain, almost 1,700 feet is that tunnel that's there still today. There was a little kid in Israel that skipped school one day, and he happened to be walking into the entrance of that cave where this water runs. And about 10 or 12 feet up on the entrance, inside the cave, up on the wall, he found some writings. And they began to study and took copies, and you can go look it up on the internet if you like to. You can actually look at the actual writing today. And it says, this is the story of the tunnel. And it actually described in Hezekiah's day how the men were working with chisels and picks, and they got so far into the mountain that they could actually hear the people coming from the other side chiseling their way. And pretty soon, chisel or axe or pick struck against pick, and they bored open this hole, which allowed water from outside the city walls to run into the pool of Siloam. And so this city became almost completely impregnable because they could survive on the water that flowed inside the city when they were under siege. It's a pretty fascinating story. And Solomon then would go on after David to build the temple in Jerusalem. We can look at a little bit of that in 2 Chronicles, the 6th chapter here. 2 Chronicles 6 and verse 6. 2 Chronicles, the 6th chapter, down in verse 6. And he says, "But I have chosen Jerusalem that my name might be there, and have chosen David to be over my people Israel." God chose David, and he chose the city of Jerusalem. I think that is extremely fascinating. And of course, when they built the temple, when Solomon built the temple, he had a day where they dedicated the temple. They actually opened the temple. And all the people were there. And all the princes and the people that were to enjoy this great temple. He had this marvelous prayer that begins down in verse 14. And he said, "O God, O Lord God of Israel, there is no God like you in heaven nor in earth, which keeps your covenant and shows mercy unto the servants that walk before you with all their hearts." And he continues on, and he basically says that if our nation gets in trouble and they begin to pray and seek your face, and they pray toward this temple, or in some cases they actually come in and pray in this temple, then hear our voice, hear our prayer, and answer our prayer. We'll look at a little bit of this. He says down in verse 20, look at this. He says, that your eye may be upon this house day and night, upon the place whereof you have said that you would put your name there, to hearken unto the prayer of your servant, that which thy servant pray toward this place. Look in verse 21. Israel which shall make toward this place, their supplication, in other words. If a man sin against his neighbor, look it down in verse 26. When the heaven is shut up and there's no rain because they have sinned against thee, yet if they pray toward this place. Over and over again through this prayer, he says that if they will come in and pray. Remember, Jesus said that this was supposed to be a house of prayer. You've made it a den of thieves. Well, Solomon here is basically laying that groundwork. And you remember on one occasion when Daniel, it says that he had been praying and fasting for a period of about 3 weeks. He went to the window and he faced Jerusalem and he prayed. That's where he got this, from this same event here. The promise that God would hear their prayer if they did pray. Solomon built the temple in Jerusalem. People did pray towards this, as I said in the case of Daniel. The city was essentially built around the temple in Jerusalem. It was fortified there by Solomon. The city, it was up on a hill, a city of many gates. You can read about all those gates. There was the fish gate and the prison gate, the gate of Ephraim, the gate of Benjamin, of Joshua. There was the corner gate, the water gate, the king's gate, and the east gate. And if you see pictures of the east gate now, you'll see that it is completely bricked up. There was an old ancient gate there. And these bricks have already been put up and completely closed off that gate. They say that because of the prophecies that this Messiah would come and enter into that gate is the reason that they bricked it up, as if that would even prevent the return of the Messiah for any silly reason. David knew that Jerusalem was blessed by God. In Psalm 122, he describes, I'd like to read this, a little bit of this here, Psalm 122, he describes Jerusalem. He wrote many of these psalms about Jerusalem. He said, "I was glad when they said unto me, let's go into the house of the Lord." I'm pretty glad to be here today, aren't you? "Our feet shall stand within thy gates, O Jerusalem. Jerusalem is builded as a city that is compact together. Whether the tribes go up, the tribes of the Lord, unto the testimony of Israel, to give thanks unto the name of the Lord. For there are set thrones of judgments and the thrones of the house of David. Pray for the peace of Jerusalem. They shall prosper that love thee. Peace be within thy walls, and prosperity within thy palaces. For my brethren and my companions' sake, I will now say, peace be within thee. Because of the house of the Lord our God, I will seek thy good. Beautiful psalm here. I think David at times looked and was dazzled by Jerusalem, the city that was called the city of David, the city of our God, Zion. And he always held it in great awe. In Psalm 137 is another one here. We won't read all this, just a little bit of this. He said, by the rivers of Babylon, there we sat down. Yea, we wept when we remembered Zion. This is like as if Zion or Jerusalem had been conquered by their enemies. And he said, we hanged our harps upon the willows of the midst thereof, and there they that carried us away captive required of us a song. And they that wasted us required of us mirth, saying, sing us of the songs of Zion. He's imagining them being in Babylon, carried away captive, and their captors telling them to sing us a song of Jerusalem. How shall we sing the Lord's song in a strange land? If I forget thee, O Jerusalem, my right hand forget her cunning. If I do not remember thee, let my tongue cleave to the roof of my mouth. If I prefer not Jerusalem above my chief joy. Remember, O Lord, the children of Edom in the day of Jerusalem, who said, raise it, razz it, tear it apart, knock it down, burn it down, even to the foundation thereof. And that, of course, was some of the things that David had to endure in his day. Peace was not always the case in Jerusalem. It was captured at one time by King Shishak of Egypt, of King Joash of Israel, of Pekah, of Sennacherib, of Nebuchadnezzar of Babylon. It was besieged. It is said that Jerusalem was besieged over 23 times. It was attacked 52 times, and it was captured 44 times. It seemed to me to be the prize of the Gentiles, and I believe today it still is. It was rebuilt, though, on a number of occasions. You remember Uzziah and Jotham and Manasseh all participated in rebuilding it. Cyrus, you remember the king of Persia, rebuilt the Jerusalem in the days of Ezra, and of course Artaxerxes during the days of Nehemiah, and we have those stories there where they went back and rebuilt the temple and rebuilt the wall into Jerusalem. It was under the control of the Babylonians under Nebuchadnezzar. It was under the control of the Persians, as I mentioned, Darius and Cyrus the Great. It was under the Greek Empire under Alexander, and under the domination of Rome, even up until the time and through the time that Jesus walked the earth. And some of those men of those leaders of the Roman Empire actually lived in the city limits or within the walls of Jerusalem. And it was destroyed by Titus in 70 AD. And Jesus, I believe, made mention of that. And of course, it was prophesied that they would be destroyed. And of course, when you read some of the history about that event, Josephus writes that over 1 million people lost their lives under that attack when they burnt the city and destroyed the walls and carried away 95,000 people captive. For a century, it was under the dominion of the Gentiles, or the domination of the Gentiles, and I believe it is referred to as the time of the Gentiles. There are a few prophecies concerning Israel. I'd like to look at a few of those. Isaiah, the 3rd chapter, Isaiah 3. And of course, this was God's judgment against Judah, or the nation of Judah and Jerusalem. He says, For behold, the Lord of hosts, doth take away from Jerusalem and from Judah the stay and the staff, the whole stay of bread and the whole stay of water, the mighty men, the man of war, the judge, the prophet, and the prudent, and the ancient, the captain of 50, the honorable men, the counselor, and the cunning artificer, and the eloquent orator. And I will give children to be their princes, and babes shall rule over them. And of course, this was because of the sins that they had committed. And the people shall be oppressed, every one his neighbor, and every one his neighbor. The child shall behave himself proudly against the ancient, and the base against the honorable. Sounds like some of what's going on in our country today, doesn't it? When a man shall take hold of his brother in his house of his father, saying, You have clothing, be thou our ruler, and let this ruin be under your hand. For Jerusalem is ruined, Judah is fallen, down in verse 8, because their tongue and their doings are against the Lord, to provoke the eyes of his glory. The show of their countenance doth witness against them, and they declare their sin as Sodom, they hide it not. Woe unto their soul, for they have rewarded evil to themselves. Say you to the righteous, and of course he goes on talking about the righteous people to stand fast. You remember, I've heard some of these people on the radio and places say that they would love to go to Jerusalem and be there when Jesus returns. You know, there was a place in the book of Revelation where Jesus calls Jerusalem Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. And of course, this is a warning here against those of Israel. I'd like to look at Ezekiel, the 5th chapter as well. Ezekiel 5 and verse 1. These warnings against Jerusalem. Ezekiel, the 5th chapter, this was a sign that Ezekiel was to give. And of course, Ezekiel was carried away captive by the Babylonians. He's in captivity, and he's actually being instructed to write down these instructions for God and these warnings that were to go out to the nation of Israel. And he said, And thou, son of man, take thee a sharp razor, and take thee a barber's razor, and cause it to pass upon your head and upon your beard. Then you take the balances and weigh and divide the hair. So he took all his hair, shaved it off, weighed it, and divided it. And you shall burn with fire a third part in the midst of the city, when the days of the siege are fulfilled. And thou shalt take a third part and smite about it with a knife. He just took a big butcher knife and just sort of chopped it up. And a third part shall you scatter in the wind, and I will draw out a sword after them. Look down in verse 5. I'll skip along here because I have other references I want to read. Thus says the Lord God, this is Jerusalem. I have set it in the midst of the nations and the countries that are round about her. Of course, that was Babylon and Nineveh and Egypt and Italy and Rome. And she hath changed my judgments into wickedness more than the nations, and my statutes more than the countries that are round about her. And they have refused my judgments and my statutes, that they have not walked in them. And of course, they were supposed to be like Jerusalem, that beacon up on the hill. They were supposed to be like a light to the world. They had been given, as Jesus said, the oracles of God. And they had all of their forefathers, that all of their history, all going all the way back to Abraham and to David and Solomon. And therefore, saith the Lord, because you have multiplied more than the nations that are round about you, and have not walked in my statutes, neither have kept my judgments, neither have done it according to the judgments of the nations that are round about you, I am against you, and I will execute judgment in the midst of you in the sight of the nations. And I will do in thee that which is not done, and whereunto I will not do any more the like, because of all your abominations. It's as if they had gone to the point where there was no return to God. And Joel, the 2nd chapter, is another quick reference here about Israel. One of the minor prophets here, Joel 2. And we usually read this during the time of the Feast of Trumpets, where it's a warning message that goes out. And I only read 2 verses here. Blow you the trumpet in Zion. Have you ever noticed that that's where the trumpet is to be blown? In Zion, in Jerusalem. And sound an alarm in my holy mountain. Let all the inhabitants of the land tremble, for the day of the Lord comes, for it is near at hand. A day of darkness, of gloominess, a day of clouds and thick darkness, a tumultuous event. As I said, people say that they want to be there standing in that day. Look at down in verse 15. Blow the trumpet in Zion and sanctify a fast. And of course, he's trying here to bring repentance to the people of the city of Jerusalem. It was the place, Jerusalem was also, I'll shift gears here a little bit, the place of Jesus' ministry. Jesus, walked up and down some of the streets, or most of the streets there in Jerusalem. He knew the street names. He knew the little shopkeepers, the bakers, and the people that lived there in Jerusalem of his day. Of course, the streets now are not the streets that were there in Jesus' day. It's been knocked down and built up over time, and the levels of the streets have been built one atop the other. He admired the buildings. And as I said, he actually began his ministry there. The gospel was preached first there in Jerusalem, wasn't it? Jesus was crucified in Jerusalem. And remember, there was this revival or on the day of Pentecost that took place there in Jerusalem when 3,000 were converted. And we know that Stephen, one of the very first martyrs, was killed there in Jerusalem. As I quoted here some weeks ago, Jesus said, "O Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you that killed the prophets and stoned them that were sent unto you." And he basically said, "How often would I have gathered you under my wings as a mother hen gathers her chicks?" It was the place, too, of Jesus' famous Olivet prophecy. And I'd like to go and read a little bit of that. Matthew 24. When his disciples ask him what is going to be the end of this age, what's going to be the sign of your coming, because he had promised that he would return. And they ask him, "Tell us, when shall these things be, and what shall be the sign of your coming and the end of the world," or the end of the age, as most of the translators will read it. And of course, they were sitting there in the Garden of Gethsemane, looking across the valley there, right at the picturesque view of the city of Jerusalem of their day. And Jesus said, "Take heed that no man deceive you, for many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many." Religious deception. What is the greatest deception that will take place? Can you think about what that might be? What is Satan's greatest deception? What does he want the world to think at this moment in time when this event takes place? What do you suppose Satan would love the world to believe at that moment when Jesus Christ comes? Maybe we'll see a little bit of that in a moment. He says, "For many shall come in my name, saying, I am Christ, and shall deceive many. And you shall hear of wars and rumors of wars. See that you be not troubled, for these things must come to pass, but the end is not yet." I believe we live in a time like that where there's the rumors of wars that could break out between North Korea or perhaps in India and Pakistan, and as we've talked about, many of these nations that possess nuclear weapons and the ability to launch them against other nations. "For nation shall rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom, and there shall be famines and pestilences, earthquakes in diverse places." And of course, this is speaking of a world war where nations all over the world are at war with one another. And he said, "All of these are the beginning of sorrows. Then shall they deliver you up to be afflicted, and shall kill you, and you shall be hated of all nations for my name's sake. And then shall many be offended, and shall betray one another, and shall hate one another. And many false prophets shall arise, and shall deceive many. And because iniquity shall abound, the love of many shall wax cold. But he that shall endure unto the end, the same shall be saved. And this gospel of the kingdom shall be preached in all the world for a witness unto all nations, and then shall the end come. When you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, whosoever reads, let him understand." Of course, I've explained that in the past, how Jesus is describing what Daniel said, that there would be this abominable person that stands in a holy place. And we believe that maybe, perhaps, those Jews will eventually build some sort of a temple there that will be erected. And this man of sin, as Paul calls in 2 Thessalonians, the 2nd chapter, the son of perdition, who is going to be in the temple of God, claiming that he is God, will be ensconced in this temple there perhaps in Jerusalem. And Jesus said, when you see that take place, then he says, when you shall see the abomination of desolation spoken of by Daniel the prophet stand in the holy place, then let them that be in Judea flee into the mountains. Of course, this is talking about that region there of that day. Don't go into Jerusalem, but to flee the area. Don't move into Jerusalem when you see all these things happening. Get away from there. In Luke, it says, when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, know that the destruction thereof is near. Jesus said that there's going to come a time when there won't be one stone atop another. Are we talking about a nuclear explosion in the city of Jerusalem? It makes you wonder, because here are those Jews that go out to the prayer wall and you see these great big stones there that are still in place. Is he referring to those stones as not being atop another? It makes you wonder if that is truly the case. Let him that be on the housetop not come down to take anything out of his house. Don't go back home. Even the inhabitants of the land there are to flee and to get out of there. And woe to them that are with child and them that give suck in those days. But pray that your flight be not in the winter, neither on the Sabbath day. For then shall be great tribulation, such as was not since the beginning of the world to this time, no, nor ever shall be. And that is talking about an unprecedented, and as I said in the past, I can't imagine a more horrific time than some of the examples I read in history. A time of great tribulation, as worse than what happened in World War II, World War I, what happened back in, in some of the pogroms that took place in the past against God's people. And except those days should be shortened, there should no flesh be saved. But for the elect's sake, those days shall be shortened. I want to quickly go ahead here to verse 29. Immediately after the tribulation of those days shall the sun be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars shall fall from heaven, and the powers of heaven shall be shaken. As we read in Joel 2 and verse 31, here in Matthew 24 and verse 29, it gives us the order of the events. The great tribulation, then these heavenly signs, and then finally the day of the Lord after all of these trumpet plagues have been poured out upon the earth. Human beings standing here, I can't tell you how many sermons I hear every week on the radio when I'm driving down the road, and people don't understand these simple scriptures here. They think that we're going to be all, wafted away up into heaven in some sort of an escape route before this happens on the earth. And yet Jesus here in his own words says that we're going to be here. We're going to be subject to persecution. And we're going to see this tribulation take place. And we're going to witness these heavenly signs. And he says, and then shall appear the sign of the Son of Man. After that period of these heavenly signs shall the Son of Man in heaven, and then shall all the tribes of the earth mourn, and they shall see the Son of Man coming in the clouds of heaven with power and great glory. So simple to understand, and yet for centuries and centuries upon centuries, men have misunderstood the order of these events. And he shall send his angel with a great sound of a trumpet, and they shall gather together his elect from the four winds, from one end of heaven to the other. And again, the regathering of his people there. And I want to go over to Luke 21, because this is another reference here, a little bit, excuse me, Luke 21 down in verse 20. And this is a parallel account here. He says, and when you shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh. He says down in verse 28 and verse 27, and then shall you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with power and great glory. And when these things begin to come to pass, then look up, lift up your head, for your redemption draws nigh. I guess I've got a whole bunch of other scriptures here I could go read to you. I would love to spend another whole sermon on this, perhaps I should, about the future of the city of Jerusalem. You know that Jerusalem is going to eventually become the throne of Jesus Christ of Nazareth. You know, and as I said, Satan would love for you to believe that it is his throne, and I believe he's going to go about trying to deceive the world into believing that he is God, and that he's going to be influencing a man that is going to move into that city, and so that the nations of the world will bow down and worship him. Excuse me, I'm sorry, my throat's a little dry. And he said, but we read in Zechariah the 14th chapter that his feet shall stand in that day upon the Mount of Olives, that he's returning to Jerusalem, the exact place in which he left. And ultimately, as we learn during the last day of the Feast of Tabernacles, that God's throne itself is going to be here on this earth. That Peter tells us that everything that we see about this earth and the heavens that we know now are going to be burned up, and that there will be a new heavens and a new earth. And I'd like to close with Revelation 21, where it talks about that. Excuse me. Revelation 21 and verse 1. And I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth were passed away, and there was no more sea. And I, John, saw the holy city, New Jerusalem, coming down from God out of heaven, prepared as a bride adorned for her husband. And I heard a great voice out of heaven saying, Behold, the tabernacle of God is with men, and he shall dwell with them, and they shall be his people, and God himself shall be with them and be their God. And God shall wipe away all tears from their eyes. And there shall be no more death, neither sorrow nor crying, neither shall there be any more pain, for the former things are passed away. Jerusalem has always been a very critical city. It was selected and chosen by God for a great purpose. It has stood as a symbol of righteousness and the center of God's revelation to man. It was also at one time a symbol of God's throne in heaven, believe it or not, with the temple there, the Holy of Holies, the altar, the table of showbread, the brazen sea, and the incense. As a result, it has been forever under attack from without. All those who are contrary to God have sought to destroy it. It has been a center of Christian worship, but also of pagan dominance. Jesus inspired John to record the messenger who describes, in the end, the two witnesses who will give their testimony in the city of Jerusalem. And he calls Jerusalem, as I said, Sodom and Egypt, where also our Lord was crucified. Jerusalem will continue to be a tumultuous city. It will be one that will be surrounded at some point, as Jesus said, by armies. And the nations of the earth will fight over its control. For Christians, the warning is that Jerusalem will momentarily be the seat of evil, who will be influencing and controlling who the Bible describes as a man of sin, the son of perdition, who exalts himself above all that is called God, who sits in the temple of God claiming that he is God. Jerusalem certainly is a place to watch. It is a city which will be a testimony of our history, the birth of Christianity, the long witness of pagan dominance, but the future glory of Jesus Christ and God our Father. What shall befall Jerusalem? I guess we will wait and see.